Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who has no idea what they're saying and is cringefully trying to improv right now. And
someone who clerked for a federal judge during one of the more recent Supreme Court justices nominations. I can't share any details, but I have to say that the conversations in chambers were riveting. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
but then come back. Please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional, and facts could change at any time. Do your own research.
You're listening to part 2 of Roberts and Them, where we discuss the modern Supreme Court. If you haven't listened to part 1, we suggest you start there.
So last episode, we talked about the different flavors of the Roberts Court and the impact of various departures and additions to the court. We're going to switch gears slightly, but Martin, we are still talking about Roberts and Them and some of the just hot messery. So I know we're going to have a good discussion today. One thing I want to talk to you about today is the notion of the swing vote. I mentioned last episode that the court used to have a justice that swings. And I feel like the way I said it, there was an opportunity for some Michael Scott-esque joke that neither of us made. And maybe we won't make today, but nonetheless, it is a different type of swinging.
That's what she said.
Ha ha ha. I set the layup for you really nicely.
It was like a Dwayne Wade to LeBron type layup. I was like spring loaded, ready to, just like Michael Scott typically was. That's what she said.
Ready to launch at maybe inopportune moments. So the swing vote concept was at play fairly often in the Roberts era up until about 2018. Martin, are you familiar with the swing vote?
Sure. I'm trying to think of anything specifically up until 2018 that illustrated the swing vote, or it might be what you're referencing. I can think of, I believe, some that have happened under Roberts, like gay marriage. Was there like an ACA thing, American Affordable Healthcare Act? Care Act, yeah. Obama, otherwise known as Obamacare. I'm trying to think. You're kind of looking at me like maybe there's something else.
No, you're doing
okay.
great. And
okay.
In fact, I'm really impressed. I mean, I am constantly impressed with Martin's layperson knowledge.
Was there a what's the word I'm looking for? Like an admissions case too that was what would now be called DEI, formerly woke. Formerly, what was
affirmative action?
Affirmative action, yes.
Cases.
Yeah, I was thinking it's an AA.
Yes.
What is it? Okay, there was an affirmative action case, right? I'm trying to think. Like, there were some under Roberts that were where there was a swing vote where it's like, oh, actually, the court kind of decided reasonably.
Yeah, so you are right, and I will be honest, because again, as a lawyer that is not a Supreme Court practitioner, and who, of all the cases you mentioned, I did study them in law school, which was a while ago, and I'm not close to constitutional law in my everyday practice. I could not tell you offhand which of the cases were cases that had a swing vote, and we'll talk more about what that means. But I just want to commend Martin and also point out the fact that you don't have to be a lawyer to be aware of these things, right? Sometimes it's just what we see in the media, and it becomes very prominent that, oh, there was a justice we didn't expect to vote a certain way, and they did vote that way, and that's why we have that outcome, and that's why it was a 5-4 in that direction and not the other. It's just really interesting that you're aware, and you could name things with no prep. Like you do not have any notes in front of you. I know. I only just kind of sent you this outline, so I think it's really impressive that you were able to speak to the importance of the Supreme Court and the swing vote, in cases that many of us might be familiar with. It's fantastic.
Yes, I unabashedly do not prepare. Like there have been times where I'm like, oh, I should Google or do some search really quick. But I'm like, no, that's not the purpose of the podcast. It's really supposed to be your layman with no formal training or knowledge. I love that you're commending me because I actually read everything in that situation wrong because I thought you were prompting me to like what historically in the Roberts court, Roberts and them, someone was a swing vote. Like, was there? Are you familiar with that being the case? But maybe you're saying more generically, but also I misread. You're encouragingly looking at me like, oh yeah, there's something else. But no, misread both of those, but still.
You did great.
Showing up. Okay. But yeah, so I guess the answer more generally is swing vote. Yes. Somebody who lies politically in the middle of the court who can kind of help determine some decisions that are close. Like obviously 5-4, it only takes one person to make it 5-4 in the other way.
So that decision largely covers the elements of a swing vote. Can you read some language? I took a look at Wikipedia, which has a great article or summary of the concept and describes how it looks in the Supreme Court context. Martin, can you read that language for us?
In the Supreme Court of the United States, the swing justice, if one exists, essentially decides the overall outcome of the ruling during a split, which can mean highly impacting landmark decisions. For example, the effective decision of the President of the United States in the 2000 election was ultimately made by Justice Anthony Kennedy in the Bush versus Gore case.
And so, I love putting fine points on things. This means that we could have had a different president or things could have gone differently had Justice Anthony Kennedy decided differently. So, Martin, just with that excerpted language, do you have a sort of better idea of the importance of the swing vote?
Yeah, no, that helps illustrate it. In the specific example, obviously, as you put it, it shows how we could have a whole different president, which is kind of an important thing. It makes me think of that, like, dominoes meme where there's like this huge thing and there's this like series of kind of like Russian nesting doll, smaller pieces that are essentially is like one little domino. And then the one little domino obviously creates this huge thing. But it makes me think of how many things, like who appointed Kennedy? How did that confirmation go? Like, what were the backgrounds? And like, that's just a whole tangled web that I'm curious about.
So, one, I haven't seen that meme, so I need to see it. And two, those are good questions and the right ones to ask when you think about where a swing vote lands and what might have been the background context, other political factors that might have led up to a justice deciding in a particular way in a particular case. But let's break the concept down a little bit more. As we talked about in a prior episode, for the past 100+ years, we've had a 9-justice Supreme Court. We talked about how that number changed and then was fixed at 9. And it's an odd number for a reason, so that someone can break the tie. When there's a tie, the person that breaks the tie is the swing vote. When the court has had roughly the same number of conservative and liberal justices, or when there are a number of moderate justices that are sometimes more liberal or more conservative in position, the swing vote meant that there might be room for internal debate to convince a single person to choose one side or the other. Does that make sense, Martin? Does that help to kind of illustrate the concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because there is discourse around the court, people understand, or at least there's, especially nowadays, lots of coverage about the politics behind things that come up before the court. And so people are starting to guess, like, once they see that the Supreme Court takes on or accepts certain cases at the beginning of a term or however that happens, they start guessing how they're going to decide. And
right.
Not just in, like, is it binary in that will they, affirm or deny ruling, but also how narrowly, what have they previously noted or written in their decisions. And the swing justice, I think there's so many layers because the people will, in certain cases, assume that a justice may be a swing justice. And then there's all this interest, in what happens behind closed doors.
Right. Absolutely right. So would you be surprised to know that the current court no longer has a swing vote? At least not in the way that it used to have.
I'm not surprised because I probably read too much like news, and I'm online too much. But I mean, also within the context of how the court has been shifting, over the last 50 years, but especially in the last, I don't know, like 8 years, it is not surprising that there is no longer a swing vote because the court has been moving in one direction. So, yeah, I'm curious what more we're going to talk about there, because there's more to dive into.
There absolutely is more to dive into, and you're perfectly setting up where we're going next. So I'm going to ask you to read some text, and it comes from a podcast episode that we actually listened to on our way up to Seattle once. Listeners, we are going to link the episode in our show references, which can always be found in our show notes. The podcast is called Above the Law, Thinking Like a Lawyer, and the episode title is The Roberts Court is Here, from November 2019. It is a little dated, just to let listeners know, but the content is still very relevant and accurate. So, Martin, can you read some text from the transcript of the episode?
You got it. Roberts is the swing vote on the court, but he is not a swing voter. Roberts is at the center of the court, but he is not a centrist. When Justice Anthony Kennedy retired, the Supreme Court lost its actual swing vote, by which I mean a justice who actually swings from one side to the other. Kennedy, love him or hate him, he would swing very far to the right in some cases, like Citizens United, and then he would swing very far to the left in other cases, like Obergefell, establishing a constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry. There is no swing vote today.
So first, I want to give Martin an air high five, because we're not exactly right next to each other because we're talking into microphones. But Martin gave an example of Obergefell, the gay marriage case, as a case that hinged on the importance of the swing vote. And we just see that coming up in this podcast transcript language. So nice work, Martin. And also, what do you think of this? I mean, what do you think of the text that you just read?
There's so much to be said. Even just the two decisions that were referenced. There's like, they both deserve their own multi-part episodes.
Yes, they do.
And Kennedy also does. But yeah, I mean, in general, like, I guess I should say I don't quite remember listening to this podcast, but I'm certain that we did. I think maybe even I'm sure it most definitely did inform my understanding that I had heard that Roberts was kind of that. I guess it's dated, so maybe I'm fast forwarding, but I've heard that Roberts was then the swing vote, which is interesting as Chief Justice too. But it's interesting that this podcast host says, or guest says, that with Kennedy leaving, there's no longer a swing vote. It's interesting. I feel as though Kennedy, aside from having a weighty last name in politics or government, U.S. history, is also an example of an old guard where there were people who were politically aligned, but also sometimes independent thinkers. And I don't want to give Kennedy too much credit here, but I think the fact that he would swing very far, I think shows a little bit of an independent streak. Again, there's even gradients of how independent can a person be. But I think even just making some of these decisions, it shows how powerful a Supreme Court justice could be, an individual making their own independent thoughts, regardless of maybe how captured they might be by politics or other nefarious things.
Yeah, those are interesting observations. And
I guess I should specify how powerful a lifetime appointment can be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. You bring up really good points, and it makes me think, and this is something that we could talk about more another time because we still have so much to get into for this episode. But the notion that could you even have a Kennedy, as potentially inherently politicized as that person or last name could be, could you have a person, could we conceive of a future court that would have something like a Justice Kennedy? Or do we think that there's so much political capture that just does not exist anymore? It's a really sort of deep question that I think is worth more fulsome discussion, and I hope we can get into, if not in this episode, at another time. I also want to point out that you pointed out that I did not properly provide the attribution for who made this comment in the podcast. So my apologies. We are going to have some more clear attribution for later text that you read so listeners can understand who said what in the episode. But the transcript is available online. And again, we're going to provide the link to the podcast as well.
Look at me like a layman just tripping into all sorts of successful little happy little accidents to borrow from Bob Ross.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to ask you to read some more language, and I've got to say that it gives me a little bit of chills because the podcast episode was recorded before Justice Barrett, who was the last Trump appointee, joined the court. And now we, as we're recording this in 2025, have the benefit of hindsight, and it's just really interesting to hear what people were thinking before Justice Barrett joined the court. I'm going to ask you to read some language, and just so you know, it's a little long, but I think it'll give some helpful context to our listeners.
One of the hosts, Ellie Mistel, says, should the worst happen, and I can't speak the name, but should we end up with Amy Coney Barrett as the next Supreme Court Justice, does that make Roberts more of a swing vote? Because now the 5 of them, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, will be so off the constitutional cliff that Roberts is pushed to defend the institution more than he is now.
And obviously we know how that played out, but please continue.
The guest, Mark Joseph Stern, responds, if you have Amy Coney Barrett on the same court as Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, that court is going to be joyriding right back to 1791. It is going to be obliterating the New Deal, obliterating Roe, Obergefell, Miranda, Wright, all of these really vital decisions in progressive jurisprudence. I think they are going to be gone. And Roberts can complain. He can go along for the ride. He can try to moderate them. But as Brennan always said, with 5 votes, you can do anything around here. And once Roberts is pushed out from the middle and that conservative faction has an extra hardcore nihilist, then Roberts doesn't matter.
Wow. So that was a lot, Martin. But what do you think about what you just read?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to read after we know what happens. Also, this definitely, you sent me this quote, and we listened to this podcast too, and this helped, I think, refresh and inform my knowledge. So I guess I cheated by being ahead of the game for the podcast preparation. Yeah, I guess it just shows how important the elections are and how important politics can be, that these huge progressive jurisprudences, as Mark Roberts put it.
Mark Joseph Stern.
Mark Joseph Stern, sorry.
There's a lot of names in here, so it's all good.
But yeah, as you know, as he referenced, yeah, there's some more important impacts to some of these political things that go on. And yeah, I mean, the court has been so politicized and moved in one direction. It's tough.
It is tough. And I can imagine these podcast hosts and their guests being very smart people. I know particularly of Ellie Mistel's name, and you can imagine that they, having had this discourse and then seeing what happened in 2020 and subsequent, is hard, right? And we living it recognize the difficulty. You know, with the Dobbs decision from 2022, we know that Roe is gone. And reminder for the audience, Roe versus Wade was the case that protected the right to abortion. Obergefell, which is mentioned in the text that Martin just read, is the gay marriage case, and Miranda is the right to remain silent case. And I agree with Mark Joseph Stern that these cases are in very real danger. I mean, how could they not be, right? If we could get to Dobbs, then we could get to an overturning of Obergefell, conceivably. We could get to an overturning of Miranda, an extremely critical, even if often on paper, piece of civil rights jurisprudence. So if we think about all these things, I don't want to catastrophize too much, and I do feel like there's still space for optimism. And just as you said, you know, if we're watching closely, if we're we're being very active in who we're voting for so that they're helping to make the right decisions that we then see reflected in the court. There is still some space for hope, but all that said, thinking about this, what do you think it means for those of us who don't have Bezos and Musk money that these progressive cases are in danger?
Yeah, I mean, as is the case and always has been for those of us without billions of dollars, these laws and decisions actually apply to us. Whereas
right.
if you do have that, the laws never really do. Yeah, it is really easy to go down a catastrophizing hole. And yeah, I mean, just thinking through if Roberts was a swing vote before, and I think in that podcast they also go on to talk about how Roberts potentially cared about his legacy. Hopefully, I'm not jumping ahead yet again, but
no, you're that's great.
And you know, as who was it, Mark Joseph Stern said, with five members of the court, doesn't matter what Roberts wants to do anymore. Like even if gosh, just crazy again. I'm definitely going down some catastrophizing, but if Roberts is on the outside looking in and he was the sane one, like I mean, hard to say sane. Like if he was the relatively less harm from that side of the court and now he's on the outside looking in, what's going to happen? Yeah, and I think for the audience, probably specifying Dobbs overturned Roe, which, as you mentioned, was the case that protected the right to abortion. So now there is no federal protection for
Correct.
abortion rights. And as we often hear yelled and screamed, it's up to the states' rights to decide what happens there. And we've seen
Congress.
Okay, yeah, I guess that is the checks and balances, right? The legislative can,
we know how well that works.
Pass a law, right? Because they can pass a law that somehow the Supreme Court can then interpret however they want to, as we've seen. But yeah, I mean, even just specifically that, like we've seen all these impacts, and that also deserves its own case or its own episode. That and Obergefell, they relied on some of, I think, the same jurisprudence and legal reasoning as a lot of these other cases, which was, I think, the right to privacy. Which means, yes. What are the other landmarks? Does loving get overturned? Can you not have interracial marriage?
Man.
Well, no. Let's just leave it up to the states. Like they'll decide rationally and reasonably.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean the hosts again. They pointed to 1791, and it seems like that's what they're doing. Like we're going back both culturally, but also even just the way that the country is governed. It's no longer feels like it's the United States. It's a lot of infighting and vitriol going back and forth, I guess. And then Miranda, I wanted to comment, the right to remain silent. I mean, that's already been chipped away at. I feel like there have been some cases, if not in front of the Supreme Court, that have kind of chipped away at the right to be read your rights. Yes. So yeah, I mean, to circle it back to if you don't have Bezos money, maybe it doesn't affect. Like if you want to go with the glass half full, like yeah, sure, maybe they'll tear down these laws, but these laws never really did much to protect like the you and I's of the world anyway. Like maybe I'm just
don't
going
know
too
that
far.
I could agree. I mean,
if they want to get you,
I don't want to agree with that in large part because I went to law school and I have to believe that the rule of law is a thing. But it's also sometimes a right on paper, even if it's a right on paper, it may take a while to get enforced in practice. We saw that Brown versus Board. It took a very long time for school desegregation. And in fact, there's places where that's still very much in question. But without something codified, without something that's a law or a Supreme Court case, I mean, in the absence of that, then you just have a total free-for-all. So I would not, and the people that suffer from that the most are the yous and I's, the regular, everyday people. So I would be in favor of continuing to push for the on paper, the 100-page opinions that say we're going to continue to uphold Miranda or whatever it is that we still do have, right? But yes, we went into a dark spot for a little bit, but to bring us back or bring us in a different direction. Yeah, so there's really just an absence now. There's no more Shorty Swing My Way. Number one, I told you guys this is a music podcast. And number two, I actually just wanted to hear myself singing to the microphone for the first time because I've not recorded myself actually singing on this podcast microphone. We'll see how it sounds. It might get cut. But anyway, Martin, any thoughts on our music podcast segue?
Well, one, I always love hearing you sing, whether on microphone or wherever. So, I'm all about that. Two, I'm trying to figure out what song this is.
What? What
song is this?
What? Listeners, wow. I've arrived at a moment where I'm speechless, but only temporarily because we're on the free version of Zoom.
That's Fetty Wap.
What? Fetty Wap? Oh my gosh.
But it's like I don't hear it because it's Fetty Wap. His voice is.
My co-host is wow. So no, it is by KP and Envy. Shorty Swing My Way.
I don't even know who KP and Envy are.
It starts slow and then it builds up. Sure looks good to me. Oh, would you please swing my way? Wow. Okay, that was a minor digression, but listeners, I really hope you know the song by KP and Envy, Swing My Way, and it's not Fetty Wap. And please go listen if you haven't listened. Anyway, because hashtag free version of Zoom, what the loss of a swing justice means is that cases are consistently, and not always, but consistently decided on ideological lines. So, Martin, this may seem obvious, but what do you think that means for how decisions are made?
Not good. No. I don't know.
2 words. That's it. Fair.
No, I mean, it means, one side has an advantage, and I think they'll readily take advantage of that, and we'll see them, that advantage start to creep. They'll use that advantage to, take up cases that they want to decide. They'll continue to push the bounds until there's something that causes the pendulum to swing back.
I think that's right. I think that really hits the nail on the head. Of the 9 justices on the court today, there are 6 justices that were appointed by a Republican president, and you could argue conservative justices, and 3 presidents appointed by Democrat presidents. You could read into that liberal. And because the justices do not typically cross lines, this means that, as Martin said, the court leans more conservative in its decision making. And I mean, quite honestly, there's really not a need for a swing vote now, right? Like, is there, Martin, do you see any conceivable benefit to the 6 conservative justices seeking consensus with the 3 liberal justices anytime?
Benefits to society, maybe, but I mean, no. There's no incentive to, like. Not only is not really a benefit realized, but there's no incentive to, because, like, as described, these 6 justices all lean the same way and view things similarly, and will, I think, very predictably make decisions. So there's really no incentive whatsoever for them to. I think they will, and you could argue that they're. I'm leaning into the nihilist side with the hey, laws don't even matter on this legal podcast. But I think there will be some benefit, and I think these justices are people too, and they will be concerned about their legacies or the politics behind things. One example that I can think of is that I think Roberts has often been accused of siding with the liberals when the decision's already been made. So it makes decisions seem like maybe they're closer than maybe they really are. I don't know. I'm sure there's some political benefits that they could find. Maybe get another RV. I don't know.
As much as we look at things with suspicion on this podcast, and I think it's often the right approach to do have a healthy amount of skepticism, And I did ask the question in a leading way. I think there has to be some benefit because there are still cases that are decided unanimously. There's still 9-0 cases. All the justices agree. Those cases still happen, and they're a non-zero subset of the set of opinions, even year after year after year, even as we've seen the court change. So there's some benefit, and it still may happen. And I think it still means that the fights that are undertaken for noteworthy causes for civil rights cases and others, the people that work very hard to put arguments together once they are accepted by the Supreme Court, and we know that happens in a very small percentage of cases, it's still worth fighting for because that still happens. We still find agreement across the board. Nonetheless, though, it's not just the loss of the swing vote that makes this latest iteration of the Supreme Court frustrating. There's another problem that Martin and I have with Roberts and them, and we've talked about it on the podcast before. It's related to the topic of, yachts and RVs and things. This court is known to be one of the most influenced by politics. And Martin, if you were to simplify it, if you were to, think about, set aside all of the Reddit posts and news broadcasts you've seen, why do you think it is that these 9 people, or maybe some subset of the 9, are so influenced by politics today?
Because they can be, and because it was designed that way. Like it was, clearly a concerted effort to capture the court through, dark money and, other sort of nefarious means, I think. And the writing's on the wall. We can go into probably a whole episode just talking about this, but there's a whole gigantic machine that basically churns out these judges, and it's been their goal, and a large body of people have made it their goal.
That's a bar. I have no disagreement. Very well said. In addition, can you read this excerpt from a June 2024 PBS article to give our listeners some statistics?
The survey from the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that 7 in 10 Americans think the High Court's justices are more influenced by ideology, while only about 3 in 10 U.S. adults think the justices are more likely to provide an independent check on other branches of government by being fair and impartial.
So 70% of people in the United States think that the Supreme Court is politicized. And I'd say that is not good. Can you read the next excerpt from the article, please?
Borrowing from my expert terminology, not good. Confidence in the Supreme Court remains low. The poll of 1,088 adults found that 4 in 10 U.S. adults say they have hardly any confidence in the people running the Supreme Court, in line with an AP NORC poll from October. As recently as 2022, before the high-profile ruling that overturned the constitutional right to abortion, an AP NORC poll found that only around 1/4 of Americans lacked confidence in the justices.
Aside from knowing that 1,088 people is a fairly small sample size, given the size of the United States population, what are your thoughts, Martin, about these stats?
That is a really small sample size, but I'm not surprised. Like, the mask is off. I think particularly the case they referenced, the constitutional right to abortion, Roe versus Wade, which was overturned in Dobbs, impacted 50% of Americans.
Right.
And I think the mask was off. People understood what was going on, and that the court has been captured and is no longer acting as an independent judicial, as stated in the poll question, that an impartial and fair body. Now they understand, it's a bunch of right-wing justices basically making law, which is not their job. I think every one of the justices that voted to overturn Roe were on C-SPAN, like there's recordings, we could probably YouTube each of them saying Roe versus Wade is settled law. And
that may or may not be an idea I have for how we deep dive on the justices, but yes.
So I think it, just, like I said, the mask is off. I think it's very clear. It's not to say it's not that different from what has been going on forever, but it seems as though people are a little bit more aware of how bad it is.
Yes. So 1,088 people is not really the size of any town. Or what I mean to say is even small towns are generally larger than that. So again, we cannot overstate how small the sample size is. But I think these folks are fairly representative in that it does seem very clear that your average American citizen thinks that there is an erosion of trust in the United States Supreme Court. And there's reasons for that. It's not just out of nowhere a switch has flipped. It is because of reasons that we're going to talk about, that there's evidence or there's indications that make it very clear that there's political capture on the court. So to give listeners some more details and some more information that they can consider in addition to the research the statistics that we just discussed, we will also share a link to a very interesting Georgetown Law Journal article from 2020 about the partisan nature of the Supreme Court. In full disclosure for everyone, I read 2 pages of this article, and it's 31 pages. This font is small. Law Journal articles, man, like, I was in law school, and I was not on a journal, but I remember the process, and, like, people love to write, and there's just so much writing and so much text. So this is really for the hardcore nerds out there, but I will say that the 2 pages that I read were absolute fire. So I do plan to give the full thing a read, and I hope you all do too, because these are serious issues. How did we get here? What does it mean? What does it look like as we consider decisions that the Supreme Court releases? So yes, we will be sharing that resource for you. As we get close to wrapping up this episode, Martin, I'd like you to read some language from, and I'm so excited to have you read this, the Supreme Court's Code of Conduct. Please, Martin, take it away.
Oh, the fact that you're excited. All right. All right, so here we go. A justice should not allow family, social... I can't even make it through the first few words. A justice should not allow family, social, political, financial, or other relationships to influence official conduct or judgment. A justice should neither knowingly lend the prestige of the judicial office to advance the private interests of the justice or others, nor knowingly convey or permit others to convey the impression that they are in a special position to influence the justice.
There's more.
I was curious, do I react here to that?
If you read the next line, and then yes, I know you will have thoughts, so you can react.
Okay, here's the next one. A justice should not be swayed by partisan interests, public clamor, or fear of criticism.
So, listeners, we will provide the link to the Code of Conduct. It is a real thing. We promise we are not making this up, and all of this text is in there.
What are you talking about? It sounds completely made up.
There's no Code of Conduct.
There's no, what? Is that a joke? Is that where I put in the rim shot? Yeah. Oh, yes, I have thoughts. When we were getting ready for the episode, you said you were kind of excited for this, particularly because I would have thoughts, and I kind of got an inkling at the moment, but just so simply, a very easy and simple way to just upset me. Frankly, it just really...
I was laughing, almost cackling with glee at knowing how you're gonna react.
There's There's so much here. We could spend the whole episode probably on just these two quotes and
Yes.
and like Googling stuff because there's so much out there. But it's infuriating. Like on the one hand, yes, these are very simple and basic, clear, straightforward. I think it's hard to get everyone to agree on something. I think almost everyone would agree that, yeah, judges should not allow their family or political, financial, any sort of relationship influence their job, which is to judge impartially. That being said, of course, judges are all human. We are all human. There are going to be things that influence your judgment, your life experiences. Like if you really want to get philosophical about that. That being said, yeah, truly, I can't believe this exists. I just, I feel like in headlines I've read a lot of the time that that they don't have a code of ethics.
Code of ethics is different than code of conduct, and whether something's right.
Leave it to lawyers.
I mean, yes. Sorry, y'all.
I'm sorry. Pardon my using.
Sorry. And also, these are words that have no. You don't have to sign it.
What is the mechanism?
You don't have to.
Right.
Correct.
You don't even have to sign it, which is another
it's
magical ritual that's like made up that we say means something. Because, yeah, what is the mechanism by which they're even reviewed, investigated? On the other hand, there is a mechanism. Like I was trying to give it the Kasey treatment and say, hey, we're all humans, like be very understanding and lenient. And not to say that you would give these folks a pass in any means. But again, realistically, you cannot expect somebody to allow their family or their life experiences, which are tied up in their political thoughts, their social life, their financial means, to not creep into their there's no way that doesn't exist, right? Humans don't exist,
and we don't want that. In the last episode, you pointed out how just looking at the demographics of the court, just how much it's changed, right? When you looked at the Warren Court, the image, versus when you looked at the current Roberts Court, that's a totally different composition of people. And you want those backgrounds to be coming in. You want Justice Sotomayor to be thinking about her childhood in the Bronx when she's deciding cases about criminal justice, about access to justice, about access to the courts. You want that. But do you want somebody to be able to say, here's this gift, and then someone else not disclose it, and then there's no means of penalizing them for their failure to disclose some gift for a party that they then decide in favor of? Right? Like, it's just, yeah. So, sorry. Wow. I felt myself get on that soapbox. I felt it.
I could just hear you taking over my role. And in my head, this intentionally super cheesy, but in my head, I was like, snaps. Yeah, I mean, we seriously could spend a whole episode on this, but
yes,
a justice should not be swayed by partisan. So, take it how you want to. And exactly as you said, these very basic rules have clearly been flouted by certain members. And yeah, what do we do about it?
Well, Martin, I don't have an answer for you. And I think this is a great place to close out our episode because we have more to discuss, and we will as we deep dive into all of the members of the Roberts and them Supreme Court. But as always, we will leave listeners with a call to action. First thing you can do is to learn more about the efforts in Congress to require ethics reform for the Supreme Court. There are calls for an ethics code. Yes, different than a code of conduct that can actually be enforced with actual consequences. Gasp! The code of conduct that Martin just read for you, at least an excerpt of, is a good start. But as we've pointed out, today there aren't any consequences for justices violating it. We'll share a link to a great article from the New York City Bar Association that kind of goes into more of this discussion and talks about how we can think about approaching a world where we have an enforceable ethics code. And just so you know, 2 of the justices on the Supreme Court, today's Supreme Court, already think this is a good idea. We'll link to a CBS News article where Justice Jackson talks about the importance of an ethics code.
Not to spring a controversial comment at the end of our episode.
Let's hear it.
But ironically, those on the right of the court, I think likely in decisions, assuming, basically, I'm sure many of them have said, not only in decisions, but in their everyday life and conversations, if you've got nothing to hide, what are you worried about?
Why did you run?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I don't like using that logic.
Right. Totally.
But truly, if you don't believe you're acting unethically, like,
what's wrong with signing your
what's the
name
concern?
on an ethics code? What's wrong with saying every year I will submit to an annual review?
And
You got nothing to hide?
frankly, if we want to go back to Neelis Martin, like, what's stopping you from signing that and behaving exactly how you have been? Like, you are
Also true.
You signed the code of conduct and you clearly don't care. Like, why not just, play the was it the horse and pony show of signing and being like, oh yeah, we got to act ethically. There's clearly no repercussions. So,
Well, I think these are really important issues to keep discussing, and I hope that our listeners will engage with us. We'd love to know what else you think. But Martin, any other calls to action that you have for our audience?
I've got nothing except for, tuning into our next episode and the future episodes where we take a deep dive on Chief Justice John Roberts and the court Kasey affectionately calls Roberts in them.
Roberts in them. Martin, can you hit us with the outro?
While you wait for our next episode, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and Threads, and Lawyer and Layman on TikTok, Twitter, and pretty much everywhere else. We're also on YouTube. If you like the vibe, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know if there are any topics you'd like us to explain. Don't walk around not knowing.